Hello. I wanted to sit down and make this video, just talking about some of my thoughts on the subject that you saw in the title about wrestling with God. Um, it's something I've written about a little bit, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, just due to exploration into Scripture and into the Bible. And I wanted to sit down and talk into a camera because I think it could not only help me get my thoughts out, but maybe it could help someone else come to conclusions of their own. And I thought it'd be a good project to work on. And I'll probably make some more videos of this same kind of style of me sitting down and talking about things. Obviously, this in particular is going to be a little more theological and a little bit more Christian, but I don't think you have to be, disclaimer, I don't think you have to be Christian to enjoy what I'm about to say or take anything away from it, as long as you're willing to acknowledge some of the wisdom in Scripture, even if you don't consider yourself a Christian. So there's this idea, kind of deep rooted in Christianity, of wrestling with God. And I've been thinking about it a lot due to my own exploration, particularly in Job and in Genesis. And I've been thinking about it along with that, and Jordan Peterson, who's been a sizable philosophical influence for me. He's been dealing with that subject of wrestling with God himself, and from what I understand, it's what his new book is going to be about, which I'm very excited to read, see if it comes to any of the conclusions I came to here. So there's this idea, wrestling with God. And a long time ago, not a long time ago, like a year ago, I sat down and I did like a full comprehensive study of the book of Job. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's so interesting and unique compared to all the other books. It's almost out of place. It's so unique. So I sat down and did a pretty comprehensive study on it. And that was very fascinating, and I picked up a lot of things from that. And then more recently, I was walking back through Genesis, and in particular, the lineage of Abraham, through Abraham to Joseph. Basically, I was really looking into that period in particular, partially because I was wanting to look more into this idea of wrestling with God, because obviously there's the great story of Jacob wrestling with God, or you could say an agent of God, depending on who you ask, on what the figure was that Jacob wrestled with. So I was looking back through Genesis to really try and ground my ideas in this. So there's a story of Jacob in the wilderness, where he is confronted with the Spirit of God or an agent of God. Text isn't exactly clear, but I think the effect of either interpretation is basically the same. So I don't really care how you want to interpret that. But Jacob wrestles with God, or this agent of God, throughout the night, and he doesn't give, and he grapples well, and he perseveres throughout the entire night, which, if you're a wrestler or if you're a grappler, you'll know that wrestling is something that is extraordinarily tiring, more so than most other physical activities. So I think it's worth noting there that there's this element of perseverance and not allowing fatigue to stop you. That's just a note. I'll probably elaborate on that a little bit more. But Jacob wrestles with God throughout the night until God touches Jacob's hip after Jacob refuses to give in, after God asks him to, basically, to give in, to let him go. And God touches Jacob's hip and dislocates it. And God says that he has wrestled well, and he has prevailed against both God and man. And then he grants him the name Israel. And I think this is so interesting. So he gives him the name Israel. He renames Jacob to Israel. God declares that. And then Israel becomes the name of God's chosen people, which is such an interesting connection, right? Because God's chosen people are those who wrestle with him. Like the implications of that are huge, and it's so interesting. So, like I said, Jacob is characterized as having great perseverance in this story. Jacob wrestles all night, and not only man, but with God. The translation of the name Israel, from what I understand, is literally he who wrestles with God. So the fact that God's chosen people in the Old Testament are those who wrestle with him is just so, I'll probably say that over and over again just because it's so impactful. It has very, very deep implications about the nature of God and what he expects from us as men, and what he expects from us as his people to wrestle with him. I also think it's important, the language used there, it's wrestling, it's grappling, it's not striking, it's not attacking, it's wrestling. Wrestling implies struggle, give and take to subdue the opponent, but it's never ill intent. It's never the same way as, it's hard for me to explain. When you're wrestling with someone, you're grappling with them, and it's often just whoever ends up on the floor, whoever gives up, whoever gets pinned, if you're talking about actual Greco-Roman or freestyle wrestling. We're talking about pinning the opponent, right? About subduing them, but it's not attacking them. You're not strangling them. You're not hitting them. You're not striking them. So I think it's very interesting that we're not to be people who attack God, but we are to be those who wrestle with him. It's just an interesting kind of choice of language, and I think it's important. So this kind of leads me to my next thought. It's that it can be hard to get a good picture of what wrestling means for us as Christians, because where do we draw the line between wrestling and attacking? The story of Jacob's wrestling match doesn't exactly answer those questions, because it's kind of cryptic. It's hard to understand if you've ever read through that part of Genesis. And a lot of Jacob's story is like that, where he has this dream of God in this place, and he sees the stairwell up into heaven, or Jacob's ladder, the idea of this never-ending spiral up to heaven, and God is seated both at the top and the bottom. Very fascinating imagery, but it's not exactly clear. It's kind of cryptic, almost mystical. And this story of the wrestling is no different. So Jacob's wrestling match doesn't answer this question of what it really means to wrestle with God outside of this literal wrestling match that Jacob has. But as I said before, I think the book of Job is actually a better explanation of how we are to wrestle with God than the story of Jacob's literal wrestling. So I could delve into the story of Job for a really long time, and I might make another video just on my thoughts on Job. But for the sake of time, I'll just summarize here. So God declares Job to be a good man in an age of wicked men. Yet he allows everything to be taken from Job, other than his wife, which that has some interesting connections in the biblical ideas of marriage and what it means to be one flesh with your wife, that kind of thing. But that's another topic. So he makes this bet with Satan, basically, to allow Satan to go after Job, because God has faith in Job, and he says this is an honest and good man, and he will not turn from me despite the hardships that I'm about to allow Satan to inflict on him. So God allows this. He allows him to be infected with all sorts of terrible diseases, and all his children are killed, and he loses all his livestock. And despite this odd premise, the majority of Job is him just sort of complaining and crying out to God. to explain. He's like begging God to explain, why have you done this to me? I can't understand. And despite my actions, and as we saw in the sort of prologue to Job, it's not really a prologue, but it's kind of serves that purpose of being a prologue to Job, where God states that he is a good man. God states that he's willing to state that he's a good man. Yet he still allows all these things to happen to him. And Job can't wrap his head around that. Now, he doesn't know what we know, because he doesn't see this sort of conversation between God and Satan. And despite all this crying out and all this sort of whining, and I hesitate to call it whining, because like Job is like, he's lost everything. He's suffering. If anyone has the right to whine and complain, it's him. But there's one line that Job never crosses. He never becomes prideful. He never once says, screw you, God. You've cursed me for trying to honor you. And that makes you not the God I want to worship. That makes you an immoral God. But to say that God would be immoral for allowing him to go through all these hardships would be to declare himself as God, to do the very actions that that Satan did before he was cast out of heaven, right? To become prideful, to declare himself the ruler of morality. That's real pride, and Job never goes there. He never says, I know better than you. He complains, he strives, he calls out, he never turns his back on God. Eventually, God does come down after his friends come and belittle him and tell him, oh, well, you must have done something wrong to deserve what's happening to you. And more, his sicknesses just get worse and worse, and he calls out more than ever. He wishes he was never born. But he never turns on God. And eventually God does come down and tells him that, God basically insults him. And it's a little deeper than that, obviously, but God comes down and effectively berates him for thinking that God owes Job anything. And he reassures him that Job does not know better than God, than himself. So there's the quote, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? I don't have the citation there, but that is most definitely from the book. But not turning his back on God allows Job to then be granted more than he ever had to begin with. God says, you have not turned your back on me. You've been my faithful servant. And he receives tenfold of what he had to start with. And that's a really incredible story. And I think everyone should go read that. But like I said before, I think that is the ultimate blueprint for what it means to wrestle with God. It's to strive and to push and to give and take, but never to turn our backs and never claim that we have moral authority over Christ, over God. Because we should wrestle, and we are literally called to wrestle with God. And that's the blueprint of what that looks like, to suffer and to be willing to question. Because if you're willing to question, that means you have real faith, because you think that what you're questioning can stand up. You're willing to test it. If you're unwilling to test your beliefs, then they aren't really, you don't have faith in those beliefs. So that's what it means to wrestle with God. It's to suffer and look at it and say, why? But never turn our backs. Never say, to hell with you, and I'm just going to go curse you and die. That's what Job's wife tells him to to do in that story, to curse God and die. So I think that's what the blueprint looks like. So do be assured, the Lord knows all, has a plan for all, and he has not forgotten you. So do not be tempted to declare him as unjust, for he has never turned his back on you. So do not turn your back on him. He will always be there for you. He died for you on a cross. But yeah, I think that's the majority of my thoughts on wrestling with God. Yeah, I think that'll be about it. So I will probably make some more videos on Job as well, if that's something you all would be interested in. And I'll see you next time.